Hey Blockheads, this is DM Mitch.
And this is DM Neal.
We want to take a moment to thank all of you who support this and all other Block Party Podcast Network shows through Patreon.
Yes, thank you so much for your support.
We also wanted to take a second to tell you about our next stretch goal.
That's right. When we reach $400 of monthly support, we will begin a new podcast called The DM Book Club.
The DM Book Club will be a monthly released podcast where we have an in-depth discussion on official and unofficial RPG materials, and even some novels.
The DM Book Club will have guests just like the Dungeon Master's Block. Every book that we look at, we will discuss from the viewpoint of, you guessed it, the DM.
Books will be voted on by Patreon members, so if you want to see this goal become a reality, you can help by heading over to www.patreon.com/blockpartypodcastnetwork.
Again, thanks for listening and supporting us, and now enjoy the episode.
Well, welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the egos of all other people at the table. I'm one of your hosts, Dungeon Master Mitch.
And I'm DM Neal, aka Joke Maniac.
Today, we have another Block Party Podcast Network member joining us. We have Curt Bolin of the Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters podcast joining us today, and we're going to be talking about co-dungeon mastering. Dungeon mastering with at least one other person. It's going to be a fantastic discussion. We hope that you are excited, just like we are, to get into the meat. But first, Neal, before we do that, we have some 5-star reviews.
So our first one comes from the UK, and it is from Fab Lewis, a DM's delight. Scottish dungeon master and writer for Battle Bards here, which already, I love this review. I've been a long-time listener and have finally gotten around to writing a deserved 5-star review for this podcast. The DMB has been an inspiration to me for nearly 3 years now and has guided me on the path to become a better DM, to challenge myself creatively, and to enjoy the game in so much more depth. In particular, the world building and the real monsters and creation and inspiration, which you had some recently, episodes are a gold mine of imagination. Thanks, DMB. And I would say to that, no. Thank you, Fab Lewis, for listening and for getting so much out of it and giving us this awesome review.
Yes, thank you so much. Our next one also comes from the UK, and it is by Jordy33A and entitled Excellent, Funny, and an Easy Listen, 5 stars. This podcast is absolutely brilliant. I'm just starting out as a DM, and it's helped me think of things from a different point of view and things I'd not even thought of as important. Only on episode 11, but already inspired. Not a bad job for Americans, winky face. Much love from an English DM. Thank you so much, Jordy33A. I'm glad that we are living up to your standards.
That's awesome. But with that, we've got only one place we can go from here.
Let's head to the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meat?
The flat meat's back on the menu, boys.
So, for today on The Meat, we have a special guest, a network-affiliated guest, and it is none other than Curt Bolin, the Dungeon Master of, again, the network-affiliated show Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, a 5th edition actual play podcast where Curt is the DM to his twin 9-year-old daughters and the occasional Dave. Hey, Curt, how's it going?
Hi, Neal. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing good, and just like all of our guests, we are going to do a little bit of an interview section so that we can learn more about you. So first, the ever ambiguous, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm rather boring. It's this whole podcasting thing and Dungeons and Dragons is a very old thing and a relatively new thing for me. So this is something I do on the side. This is something I've been doing for 20 years now. playing with my friends ever since I was in high school. We started off in second edition Dungeons and Dragons. We continued playing throughout all the years. We tried a couple of other game systems, and then just recently decided to get back into D&D and check out 5th edition because it was so monstrously popular that I thought there had to be something that was there with it. And I was very pleased when I picked it up. I loved the simplicity of it, and it made me want to get my twin daughters, Samantha and Birdie, into it as well. And then I thought, hey, why the heck not? Let's record this and put it on a podcast, because I don't see anybody else doing this with kids that much these days. So there it is.
Yeah, I think I can say with confidence that there's not an actual play that makes me smile more than when listening to yours. Like that's just so like much. I just constantly have a smile on my face, and I'm just like, I don't know what's next, and I think I'm smiling because I don't think you know what's next.
Very, very rarely do I know what's going to be happening next. Although I with our show and the story, I say that I could probably be a little more heavy-handed than I prefer from a dungeon master perspective, but it's not only am I trying to make it fun for the girls and for the guest players that we have on as well. I'm also trying to tell a compelling story with this for our listeners too. So keeping 2 9-year-olds on track and focused from episode to episode and trying to tell an overarching story is a difficult thing. And so sometimes I don't give them as much freedom as I would in just a game that we'd be casually having at home. However, the caveat to that is they do have the tendency to perform more. They love making cracks and jokes and performing for the camera and the audience or what have you, because they think life is just a stage when we do our show. So they do have the tendency to be goofier and more dramatic.
Yeah, so you should definitely check that out. But the next question I have is there anything that you're currently working on right now that you want the listeners to know about?
Me personally, no. The show takes up so much of my free time. It's if I could go back in time and tell myself how much extra time doing a podcast takes, I'm not sure if I would get into it in the first place. But now that I'm in it, I love it. It's so time consuming, and so I kudos to anyone that takes this on and tries to put a show that's out there. So mostly the stuff that I'm working on is usually other people's projects or other people's shows that I'm helping to give a small contribution to, rather than actually creating a new show or some other separate project for myself.
Did you want to shout those out though?
Sure. Yeah. So like some of the shows I've been dealing with, is like the very first show, Tales from the Fandom. That's a show that discovered our show relatively recently, and David Ginsburg is the host of that show, and we became quick friends after we discovered each other. And he fell in love with our show and the format and the girls that were on that. And he had me come on to his show, and we talked about Dungeons and Dragons. I got to talk about some other sci-fi stuff. I got to talk about Dune on his show, which was a lot of fun. We also did a couple of other shows. We talked with, my girls talked with a couple of other shows. Interestingly enough, most people want to talk to my girls and not to me, which I find not funny, but interesting that having 2 little girls playing Dungeons and Dragons was such a novelty. And I don't even want to say novelty because that's almost insulting to use that word, but it was so unique that people wanted to talk to them. They wanted to get their viewpoints, their experience on it. And having me along was kind of just the icing on the cake. And so we did that with Lisa from the podcast of Behold Her. We talked with Tess from RPG Cast. We participated in Women in Tabletop Gaming Month, which David from Tales from the Fandom had actually organized and got a whole bunch of people together to record special episodes to try and promote women being in tabletop games. And Samantha, my oldest daughter by 1 minute, and she never lets Birdie forget that.
Oh yeah,
she DM'd 2 special episodes for that, and it turned out fantastic. I didn't have to help her at all with it. She put it together, and she just told a beautiful story, and was really great at the dungeon mastering. And I can't wait to have another opportunity to have her do it on our show. And then, I guess, the latest thing that I participated in is I got to actually play a character in an episode on International Podcast Month, which is this month, that IPM is going to be releasing just a crap ton of shows going on this month. So when I say I'm not up to much after listing all those things out, I'm not doing much of my own creative work, as I mentioned before, but I am trying to help out and join other people's as much as I can, as my time allows.
As someone who edits podcasts and you yourself do the editing for yours, I feel like anytime you guest somewhere, it feels like you're basically doing nothing in comparison to having to edit the content that you're creating.
Absolutely. It's just, I just have to show up and have fun. It's like, it's no work at all. It's less than no work. It's because I'm playing a game, and it's the opposite of work.
Awesome. So speaking of having fun, we're going to move to our surprise question, as we do with every guest. And I actually made this one up special for you. What would 9-year-old Curt, like, what is his pinnacle of Dungeons and Dragons? Since you have 2 9-year-old daughters in your show, what would 9-year-old Curt bring to the table?
Oh boy. I'm trying to think back at 9 years old, what I was into. I remember at 9 years old, the 2 movies that I probably watched the most and over and over and over again was Willow and the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Oh my gosh, we're practically living. One of those is the same, and my addition would be Milo and Otis, but go on.
So maybe a Milo and Otis style adventure of 2 buddies, right? Going through a fantasy world like Willow, but they both happen to be ninjas or monks in the case of 5th edition D&D.
This is beautiful. I don't know. All right, we're closing down. We can't get better than what just happened, folks.
It's funny that you bring that up, because I remember when I first picked up the Player's Handbook and I started making characters for myself, the very first character that I ever made was a monk. That was the character class that jumped out at me the most, because it was only 2nd edition. That was the last time that I actually played a version of D&D. They didn't have the monk in that edition. And I found out later that it was in 1st, and it did come back later. I think maybe even in 3 that they brought it back. I think 2nd edition, the one I played, was the only one that didn't have the monk class. So I find it interesting, especially bringing up Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that would be the class that jumps out at me the most.
Yep. That's awesome. So with this amazing adventure set up with Milo and Otis as monks going through the story of Willow, I feel like the only way that we could accomplish that would be by co-dungeon mastering. That's just a terrible segue into the topic at hand, and that is, in fact, co-dungeon mastering. So we wanted to bring you on and kind of talk through this idea, ways to do it, maybe pros, cons, just kind of free-forming what comes up. And I think the way that we wanted to structure it was different ways that you could approach it and kind of how to go about that. So did you want to bring one up first, or I can bring us into it? Either way works.
So the reason why I like this topic so much and I wanted to talk about it is because I've tried it a number of ways, and it's only ever worked out once for me. So I am very interested in talking this out to see if I could pick up some tips in other ways. So I'm going to bring to the table the things that you should not do with co-DMing.
That's great. Well, I've definitely seen it used effectively at my own table, at conventions, and in just anecdotal stories from other people. So let's start off with the idea of essentially the division of labor, if you will, is one person is doing a majority of the role playing and the other person is handling the combat. And that's kind of the co-dungeon mastering idea, is that one is taking one and one is taking the other. So apparently we'll start off with you. Have you had a bad experience with this idea?
That's an interesting idea. So just to clarify, in the scenario that you just described, there's 2 people that are both DMing all the time. It's just one of them is taking on certain aspects of the dungeon mastering, and the other one is doing the more mechanical, technical, heavy lifting. Is that right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I haven't encountered that before. I could definitely see that being very advantageous, especially if you have two folks that do want a dungeon master, but their interests lean more towards one or the other. Where have you seen it successfully? I mean, is it typically with a larger table that you do the division of labor and that how it seems to work out, or is it just they gravitate towards whatever interests them?
So typically, and a lot of this will be anecdotal and, and circumstantial and everything like that. So hopefully we can give tips that work for anyone listening. But for me personally, this was used when I had one of my younger players take the role of a DM for the first time. And his dad was co-dungeon mastering with him because he had a much stronger handle on the rules and how to, grid combat and doing everything like that. Whereas for him, he was more interested in being able to tell the story and bring us along. So then those two work together. But going back to what you had mentioned is oftentimes I see this when someone's like, yes, I'm really good at combat. Like essentially I could rule lawyer you into the ground if you wanted. And the other person is like, I couldn't care less what the rules are, but I have this rich story to tell, but I do want engaging combat and two people kind of interacting on that level.
I could also see that being an advantage for the players as well, that if it is someone that is new to the dungeon mastering chair, trying to keep the action flowing along and moving along as quickly as possible, just so that players aren't sitting there watching their DM page through a book or trying to check the rules. Although depending on the mix of the table, I'm sure that there's people that would be okay with that, or at least just flubbing the rules for a moment or just glazing over them to keep the story moving along. I could see that being advantageous if you know that you have a couple of rules lawyers that are sitting down as players at the table that won't let any deviation from the rules fly.
Mm-hmm. And I think this one might take up a majority of our time because I think it does start to fit into a lot more of those, because you had also mentioned, would this happen at a much larger table? And I think that that's another kind of scenario you could get into where you have a larger table where one is kind of handling the story and maybe not just combat, but if we adjusted the idea that someone is handling, air quote, the rules. Mm-hmm. So if there is that side conversation that needs to happen, it happens with the second DM, and the first DM is still continuing the story with the other people.
Right. Or trying out a new game system. That sounds like that would be a perfect setup, that if you wanted to bring someone in that is a really fantastic dungeon master, tells a great story, great narrator, great character development, but they don't know the mechanics of whatever tabletop game it is that you're playing, but you want them to be able to participate and not slow anything down. I can see that being a great combination into a new game like that.
So the other thing with that, I guess, is a little bit of a con is definitely figuring out where you have that division and this is going to be true of literally everything else I think we say, is that making sure that division is working for everyone at the table, be it the two dungeon masters, as well as all of the players, making sure that there's not one's taking over way too much. So then the other person is basically just sitting there and, making sure that divides evenly.
That's always been my biggest challenge whenever trying to do co-DMing on any game. And we tried a couple of different formats of switching off, one being full-time, the other one being part-time, or each just taking a part of a particular story, or even one of us taking over particular areas and being just the subject matter expert on this geographical location of a campaign. And so I'm sure that we'll probably get into all of those topics and talk about those things. But the point that I want to make is, like, any situation that we got into, the thing that I struggled with the most was the division of labor. And so it's just from my past experience, it's like whoever it is that you're going to be getting into co-DMing with, you need to make sure that you do feel really, really comfortable with them. And I think that you need to make sure that the boundaries are pretty clear on where the lines are driven, or where the lines are drawn on who does what. Because if you're not clear about that at the very beginning, I think there could be a little bit of resentment that ends up at the end of someone doing more work than the other. And as soon as someone stops having fun, then it's not worth it. It's like you need to stop, figure it out, because that's the whole reason why we do this.
Definitely. And I think that, you had kind of mentioned it, and to segue into our next kind of setup, part of it is definitely, there's some level of difficulty for people to give full player agency over. That's completely out of the window if you're having someone else full blown run the game. Like your willingness to give the keys over and get ready for the ride has to be pretty far up there to be able to co-dungeon master with another person, because they could take the story in a direction that you're not expecting. I mean, more so than if it's just your players trying to do that.
Right.
Because you can just kill them. So
yeah, you got it. Yeah, if you take that route of completely handing over to someone else, you're giving your baby up for adoption. That's it. You have to let them take it over, because if you're not willing to give that up, then again, you're going to run into another situation, I think, that of where there could be hurt feelings, some resentment that's there, and one of you is going to stop having fun with it. And just be prepared for doing that sort of thing. And it is harder than I ever thought that it would be, of handing the keys over to someone else to take it over. Because it's like, as badly as I wanted to play a character in this world that I created, that I started with this other DM, and I handed it over, it was like almost immediately like, nope, don't like this. Don't like where this is going.
Yeah, you can just feel your body tensing. So an interesting way, and I've heard it used in some actual play podcasts, where one DM has the fairly traditional role as we think of it. You know, they're running the story, but the second DM plays all of the NPCs.
I heard about that one recently, and I think it's a really novel idea. I really, really like that concept a lot, because I think it does get into, well, it kind of goes back to some DMs or some players, they gravitate towards certain aspects of the game. And having that kind of a setup really gets someone to focus on just the DM aspect of it. But if you have someone else that likes the DM but also likes to play characters at the same time, it's like, boom, best of both worlds right there. They get to create all the NPCs. They get to develop them. They're going to be around for a while. They're going to be fleshed out. Well, I would hope they'd be around for a while.
Yeah.
They'd get fleshed out. And so then that person could control how they develop as characters. And so they would get kind of their player character fix in there, and also their dungeon mastering as well.
Definitely. And it all depends on how the story is going. And you, in that scenario, you can feed back and forth on each other how much you want. Or, as the DM, you also, I kind of lean towards this one only with the idea of you get to be surprised a little bit more than normal, because, let's say I have you play the NPCs and I'm like, okay, you're a shopkeeper. That's it. Like, maybe that's all I give you and you just run with it. And then I get to experience the players interacting with you as the shopkeeper right then and there. And maybe it's you have this magic item or you need to give them this quest, but literally nothing else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the idea. I'm in love with it, and I can't wait to try it out.
So one of the examples we had was Devin Rue, who is the map mistress. Definitely go check her stuff out. She made a map for the world the forum created, Deimbe, and is just absolutely amazing. But she couldn't attend as often as she wanted, so she worked with the DM, and basically when she could attend, she was an NPC, and she'd actually dress up in character, stay in character the whole time, and just pretty much turn it all the way up to 11.
The professional NPC. Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah, I think I did hear that episode, and that's where the concept of it I got introduced to on that. Nice. And so then maybe start looking up a little bit more. It's such a fantastic idea. And I think it's even better that they sort of just stumbled onto it, that it just organically came out of their process about aligning schedules and getting people to show up, so that they were able to be innovative and adapt and come up with a system that worked for everybody. I think ended up probably being a better experience for everyone than it would have been when they initially started.
I would definitely imagine. And kind of dipping into the potential pitfalls, if you have this truly amazing NPC that is established, then you are kind of beholden possibly to making sure that DM is there every time. Because I guess that's also just my personal fear of the idea of, let's say you make that shopkeeper and it is pretty much the most beloved NPC ever. I would hate to have to then try and play second fiddle and attempt to be the NPC that you as the co-DM had created.
I particularly like this concept of co-DMing when it comes to getting more people to try dungeon mastering, because it feels like, at least from my experience, it seems like the most people, it's not coming up with the story or with the adventure, it's the NPCs that they have the most trouble in fleshing out. It's making characters that are interacting with the other players at the table, that seems to be the thing that folks struggle with the most when they first start trying to get into dungeon mastering. So I could see that being a great segue to get them to try it, because more people need to dungeon master. It's just, there's just not enough people out there that are willing to do it.
Yeah, and this is as good a place as any to kind of talk towards that. I had mentioned it as, someone being not as comfortable, so then co-DMing. And I think that's a great way to just offer it up to your players, potentially, is does anyone want to DM? And maybe you're afraid, but I'll step alongside you to like that first time out. What do you think you're weak in? I'll cover that while you do the rest, just to get your feet wet and actually experience being on the other side of the screen. I think is a really great idea to throw out to your players, because if someone else does it, then that's how you kind of get a break. I'm just throwing it out there. We all need breaks to like refuel our creative juices. And that's kind of where the idea when I used it was, that's essentially like, if I kind of get to the end of an arc and I'm feeling like, maybe I need to take a session or two off, then I'll have someone else step in and take the reins.
That's primarily the scenario of co-DMing that I'm the most experienced with. We had the same group of guys that got together, the game for years and years. And it would just be me and one other person in the group that would switch off dungeon mastering. And there's you do need to recharge. The creative juices need to be replenished, because there's only so many years that you can go being the dungeon master for before you need a break.
Definitely. So speaking of places we could go, see, now that's not a bad segue. Yeah, it was still bad. So for the next idea, and you had brought it up as well, was the idea of, I know we're going to throw it in the Wayback Machine, of old computer games, and you go to a new area and it says, please insert disc 2, because that's where that area is on. And you have to insert the new CD, load it up, and then you can start being and adventuring in that area. But you had mentioned essentially someone is, let's say, extremely proficient at this area of the world. So then they take over the dungeon mastering because they know all about the history, about the people, about the quest, about everything. And so it kind of just switches off based on where you are in the world that you're adventuring in. There's a good analogy, disc 2. I also like the idea of it keeping with the video game analogy of it's the new quest hub that you've just discovered in the world that you're playing in. Because while it's still connected to everything else that you've done before, the other dungeon master can take over the new characters that are in that area, all the new quests and all the new different ways that you can go from there. That's the mode I'm a big fan of, but that's one that I haven't been able to. I've done it once, loved it, and I would love to get more experience with it, because it's, from a dungeon master's perspective, a full-time dungeon master, I feel like that's probably one that's the easiest to hand off to someone else, because overall you still have main control over the overarching campaign, but you get to hand off this large chunk that sits inside of your overarching campaign. So handing the keys off to someone else, I think that's probably the easiest one from a DM perspective, to just hand that over to the 16-year-old that just got their license. Your insurance rates just went up, and it's like, and God help them if there's a scratch on that thing when they bring it back. Oh, that's so good. You're not getting your deposit back. The other thing is, of course, the potential pitfall with this one is, if the players start to be in one area for too long. I mean, is the first thought in my mind. If you think about the idea of a large dungeon, theoretically, a set of players could stay in the same dungeon for a week's worth of game time, and it be 2 years outside, because you just keep playing in that single dungeon. So then that would be definitely going back to the conversation of back and forth and who should take over when and those kinds of things.
Yeah, that could definitely happen. I think that would be an easy thing to get around, because I think it'd be so easy to change the story or change the dungeon, if you will, a little bit in between adventures to get the characters out of there and back onto the larger story or the larger campaign that needs to happen. For something like that, though, you need to have open lines of communication between the dungeon masters about either time boxing it of how long they're going to be there, or at least getting it to a certain point in the story, and that's when it's going to be handed back over to the other person. So and that's something that could come out of it organically as you're playing. But I would suggest it's not a bad idea to establish that at the very beginning so you don't have that pitfall.
Yeah. So another one, and this is one I've definitely seen more at conventions, but also seen in longer play formats, is 2 tables, 1 story. So you're essentially co-dungeon mastering because this table is trying to do the same quest that table is. Do they work together? Do they end in a terrible bloodshed? Who knows? But essentially you're in the exact same world and you're doing things that, let's say I'm running a table and they go through and they get to a town that's besieged by goblins. They decide, you know what? We don't care. We got bigger fish to fry. And then your group comes up later and finds a town that has been potentially ransacked and razed to the ground. And so the choices that one makes affects another, back and forth, so on, so forth.
I loved the concept of 2 simultaneous tables, although I would struggle with how I would actually implement it in my real life. It feels like it's something that's it's better for conventions where you have access to a lot of players all at once, and I could see that format being exponentially more difficult to run over a long campaign. So I could see that being, not to say that it's impossible, but I could definitely see that that's much easier to run for a one shot or just a couple of adventures.
Yeah. And so where I have seen it is Maze Arcana, where both Rudy Rutenberg and Satine Phoenix were essentially running on back-to-back nights streams that were existing in the same world. And if memory serves me well, they were both in Chult kind of going through the Tomb of Annihilation at the same time. The storyline, and seeing the interactions of the two or the causes and effects. And then I can't remember if they brought the groups together, but some amalgam of that. And like you said, though, it needs to be pretty structured to make it work well, unless it is, and it's either very structured or I think very free form.
Yeah, one concept similar to that I've been toying around with, and because I've been trying to figure out how to get that concept to work in my real life, where just the logistics of having so many people in my house at one time playing a game, and especially over a long period of time, was that I thought of the idea of having 2 tables that through attrition of the characters dying or running off or retiring or doing something else, they leave the adventuring life. And eventually the table gets whittled down to the end game table with the players that are still left and alive. So trying to take a very, very realistic kind of gritty type of view on it, because I mean, in all reality, an adventurer shouldn't live that long. It's a very dangerous lifestyle. So I imagine that if you have a lot of people starting out with this, and just over time and naturally, it's just people are they're gonna die, they're gonna fall out. But a downside to that is that you'd have to have a group of players together that are okay with dropping out randomly and not showing up anymore. And I know some people that would probably they'd be all for it because they'd love the finality of it. They would love just the edge of your seat, the tension that would go along with something like that, because you never know. This could be the last adventure that you get to play with this character.
Oh man.
And so that's something that I've been rolling around and kicking around in my head to see if I could get that to work. But it's like, I think you'd have to get enough players together for it, and you'd have to get the right players together to pull something like that off. And logistically, I don't know if I have that yet.
Yeah. Well, that's definitely another thing to throw out. The logistics of this are definitely much more than being a single dungeon master. But I think that if it works, I think it could be really amazing. I think one of my goals, and hopefully I can do it soon, is to actually run a table, or run a table where someone is simultaneously running another table, and whether they are friends or foes, that would ultimately need to be seen in play. But is definitely a logistical nightmare at times. So I have one idea that I literally thought up on the fly, and it took me a second to figure out what it was called. But have you ever heard of the West Marches style of campaign?
No, I haven't.
So basically, it's kind of the idea that there's, let's say, 10 to 14 or some higher number of players, and it's basically on the players to schedule and get the group together. And it could be any of those sets of players, and then they just run inside that open sandbox world. And so then it could be one DM with these sets of players, that same DM with a different set, or a different DM with the same set. It could just kind of whatever mix and whatever organically happens in the world with whatever players are able to get together.
Interesting. So in this kind of scenario, if I'm understanding it right, then this is kind of a way of making the dungeon master as objective as possible, that they're really just there to enforce the rules, or maybe not even that far. They're just there to make sure things don't fly off the rails, I guess.
Yeah, basically. And then and that's part of the scheduling process, is finding out who's going to run the game. And so it's definitely a very open, very, very open idea to co-dungeon mastering, because I think basically anyone that's willing to dungeon master is going to be a dungeon master in the world.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, you'd really have to trust your players with that, and being able to stay true to playing their characters and playing the game and making sure that everyone is having fun. I could see some even. Gosh, I wonder even if rules lawyers would actually be a benefit in that case, because typically they don't let anybody get away with anything.
Yeah.
But I could see metagamers or power gamers that if you had a couple of those that were in your group, that could be a difficult thing to let them free in a sandbox and see how that turns out. Although, actually, on the flip side, that could turn out extremely interesting and fun at the same time to see how far they would take it.
So that's definitely one to do a lot of research on prior to implementing that. So I think we're kind of coming up on our time, but the question I have towards you, because I've used most of the examples I have, are there any other specific examples that you have of maybe what not to do?
Oh boy, things what not to do. I kind of touched on this already, but it's just setting expectations at the very beginning. So this is more along the lines of what to do based off of my experiences.
Okay, good.
Is setting expectations at the very beginning with whoever it is that you're going to be co-DMing with. It's the best thing that you can do for the planning of it. And then also it's make sure it's someone that you trust to be a dungeon master with this. It's if they had the tendency to do things more by the seat of their pants, or if they had the style of they do lots of planning and lots of documentation beforehand, make sure you're comfortable with their style, with their prep work, because they may run a game just fine, but because they don't have things detailed out in the way that you like them to be, that can be hard. So make sure that your styles work together, make sure you know where the boundaries are, who's responsible for what. And I think it also does help to establish a hierarchy as far as the dungeon masters are concerned, that if there is ever, even as you can be as clear as possible at the very beginning in setting the boundaries around it. And if there's some sort of executive decision that needs to be made about the way that the game is run, someone needs to be at that figurehead. So you should establish that at the very beginning, that someone needs to make the call. And once that call is made, that it stands, because otherwise then you just have people arguing with each other, and you just want to make a decision, keep playing the game and having fun.
I like it. Tons of good advice. And I'm trying to think of what could possibly be my final piece of advice. I think you really need to toss this idea out to your players and see who might bite, because I think there's probably one or two players in your group that are too afraid possibly to dungeon master for X reason. And if you're willing to say, hey, I'm here, I'm willing to sit next to you, I'm willing to support you in this idea because I want you to have that experience, and who knows, maybe create your own group. I think just tossing it out there. And if no one bites, that's literally the worst thing that could happen, is you tossed it out and no one was interested, but at least you tossed it out there. So I think that's all I've got, but I have the most important question. I always frame it that way. Where can people go to listen to your voice more if they wanted to here on the internet? They
can hear my voice, but more importantly, they can hear my daughter's voice on Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters at dungeonsdragonsdaughters.com. That's our main website. We're on most of the social sites. We're on Facebook. We're on Twitter. We're on Instagram. Our handle is typically at Daughter Dungeon. And we're also on YouTube. We do video recordings of all of our podcasting sessions, and funny enough, that's the aspect of it that my girls are the most interested in. It's it's funny. They love hearing about the podcast and how many people have downloaded and what comments and ratings that we've got on it, but they're mostly interested in YouTube and watching the videos that are on there. And I find that funny. I'm getting to the age where it's like, is this a generational thing of where unless it's on YouTube, they don't want to watch it?
Yeah. Yes, I have definitely had old man feeling conversations of like, why would you just listen on YouTube? Why wouldn't you okay, nope, I don't understand, and I accept that I don't.
Yes. So, but one last thing, and I don't mean this to sound like adversarial for anyone that's listening, but my 9-year-old daughter can Dungeon Master, and she did it after only going on like 2 or 3 adventures, and she just dove into it. And she did great. So if anyone is out there is apprehensive about doing it, don't worry about it. If my 9-year-old daughter can do it, then anybody can do it.
Done. And with that piece of advice, Curt, I just want to thank you again for coming on and spending some time with us.
You're very welcome. This is so much fun. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Neal.
Thank you. And now to the mailbag of holding.
But they have been asking for their mail on a daily basis. It's all they're talking about up there.
That right there is the mail. Now let's talk about the mail. Can we talk about the mail, please, Mac? I'm dying to talk about the mail with you all day, okay?
On today's mailbag, we have an email from The Absurd DM, and they're asking us about a paladin. But not just any paladin, a paladin that follows someone outside of like the traditional Heronius or Moradin or something like that, like getting outside of those lawful good confines, and like what is the essence of being able to go be a paladin for someone else. And they just wanted to do this in a campaign, but no one was ever interested. And so I think it's just kind of asking like how to go, I think advice on how to go about that, or in a way, I guess, convincing others that it's okay. So what is your first thought when I say a paladin that is not lawful good?
I think probably the Absurd DM, as he points out in his email to us, is coming from a 3.5 edition stance, where I believe that there were actually set rules in the book not allowing for certain alignments and gods to be paladins. And I think to me, like, the Absurd DM is saying, oh, I'd like to do this. I'd like to branch out and have this happen. Why couldn't we do something like this? To me, I would say, especially if you are running a homebrew world, but you're running a home game, it's your game, who can be a paladin? That's completely up to the DM and the creator of the world. You can have all sorts of different paladins. You can call them different things if you want. Like, I know 3.5 had anti-paladins and things to fill in that gap to say, oh, it's not a paladin, it's this other thing. But really, in the end, that restriction is completely just based on the DM who decides those restrictions. So if you as the DM say, I'd like to branch this out, then by all means, branch it out.
Yeah, and my go-to, if you're having a big discussion and you feel that there needs to be some concessions along the way, I think one of the ways to frame it is the idea that the paladin is not just this holy champion. I think the key word there is champion. And so let's say you choose someone else, like St. Cuthbert is one of the other examples, then your character could be beholden to that exact alignment of the deity as a champion of them and focusing on that. So you still have that alignment restriction, but it's based more of the person you follow than just it can only be lawful good or nothing else. So that's one way to give concessions if it is turning into like a larger rules discussion at your table. Also, I would make chaotic evil paladins and then just frustrate everyone. But that's just me. But yeah, hopefully that information is helpful for you. And thank you again, the Absurd DM, for writing in to the Mailbag of Holding. We just want to thank Curt again for coming on and spending some time with us. And of course, coming on and joining our network and bringing with him an absolutely amazing show. And if you keep on listening, you will hear more from the rest of that crew. And it is another amazing episode on its way. But if people wanted to get a hold of us, Mitch, how would they do it?
You can send us an email at dungeonmasterblock@gmail.com. Send us an email if you've ever successfully co-dungeon mastered with someone and tell us about maybe if you have some tips and tricks or just a story for us. If you like our show and you like what we're doing here at the Dungeon Masters Block, then please take 5 seconds of your time. Head on to iTunes and give us a 5-star review. We will gladly read it on the air and give you a shout out if you do.
And if you wanted to, definitely head over to Twitter and follow us at DMS_block. That's at DMsBlock. And of course, like us on Facebook, and you can keep track of us and follow all the things we post and all of the wonderful information that we have. But with that, our Patreon shout out of the week goes to Scott Myers. So thank you, Scott, for being a bronze dragon and helping support us and helping us give more information to the masses.
Yes, thank you so much, Scott. The Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network. Check out other shows like Geek Wars, Detentions and Dragons, and of course, Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, and more.
But that's it from us here at the Dungeon Masters Block, the place where we focus on the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God,
Killing characters,
and lowering the ego of all of the other people at the table. I'm DM Neal. Good night and good luck.
and I'm Dungeon Master Mitch, reminding you to keep on dungeon mastering.
I was gonna make a joke and be like, it's not Mike, it's not Seth, it's Scott Myers. No, I know. Mike Myers, Seth Myers.
Mike Myers.